currently on the side of the room here. Also, because this is where lunch will be, towards the end of our session, the caterers will discreetly, they promise, be coming in and starting to fill in food. Just try not to get distracted by your growling stomachs at the food and keep up. That doesn't mean our session's over. It means that we're getting close to it. And of course, everyone should stay for lunch and for our membership meeting at lunch. Another logistical issue is, as in our other plenaries, there's people here attending in person, and there are people next door in the overflow room, and that presents a special complication for the question and answer period. You will need to come into this room to come to the microphones if you have any questions. I encourage you to do that. Don't feel shy about coming in. As well, of course, don't feel shy when we get to the question and answer period for you guys to stand up and come to these mics. But it also does mean, importantly, to speak into the mics when you ask questions, because that way people in the other room will hear both the question and the answer, which sometimes makes more sense than just hearing an answer. Okay, with that, those comments behind me, I'm really pleased to introduce our panel of OIRA administrators who will be speaking on their experiences, and we're really fortunate to have a group that spans 4 different administrations. I'm Sally Katzen, who was administrator during the Clinton administration, John Graham, who was the administrator during the first part of the George W. Bush administration, Susan Dudley then, who finished that out, and then Howard Shalansky, who was the OIRA administrator during the Obama administration. They all have illustrative career, impressive careers elsewise, but I figured that I wouldn't go into all the lengthy introduction of their other accomplishments, because right now the fact that they're OIRA administrators is what we're all interested in. So, but feel free to also connect your remarks to your other experiences. But with that, I'll get out of the way and turn it over to our panel.
There are a few more seats up front.
Oh yes, there are some seats up front here for people in this room or in the other room if you want to come in.
I count 8, 10, 12, 14. So I think I'm supposed to start and provide some history and context for current issues and problems. And I won't go back to Nixon, Ford, and Carter. Yay! I won't even remind you of the dramatic changes that came with President Reagan. I'm going to start with Clinton, where at least I have firsthand knowledge. And thinking back of what it was like in 1993, the expectation of many, if not most, of the people who had supported Clinton was that he would scrap the whole program, that he would revoke the executive order, and he might even abolish OIRA. There had been a lot of complaints about the Reagan implementation of 12291, and concern that it was skewed unfairly, but very effectively against regulations, that costs are so much more easily monetized and quantified and monetized than benefits, that it was an unfair effort. It was seen as a tool of deregulation. It was very concerning to liberals, in particular in Congress, that OIRA's judgment would come into play when they thought they had delegated authority to the regulatory agencies and over whom they had slightly more control. And it was discomforting to them that there would be another entity that would be involved in this. And there were concerns about transparency and accountability. OIRA was viewed as a big black box. No one knew what happened when a draft arrived, and what happened to it, and why, and because of whom, were questions of concern. But notwithstanding this groundswell of nervousness, anxiety, hostility, whatever you want to call it, The people in the Clinton White House, to a person, including the vice president, who had been a fierce critic of OIRA, never really gave any serious thought to dumping OIRA or getting rid of cost-benefit analysis. I want to just drop a footnote here. I did dinner with some people last night. I remember it was cost-benefit analysis. Not benefit-cost analysis. At some point, it's sort of like I was a girl when I went to law school, and then in '75 we became women. It was really nice. There was a sea change. I'm not sure when cost-benefit analysis became benefit-cost analysis. Maybe John can enlighten us to that, or someone else. But we always thought that some analysis, some robust analysis, would be highly beneficial to the decisions about how regulations should be formulated. And as for centralized review, I have often said that if it had not existed, we would have had to invent it. The Executive Office of the President, the White House, has to have some sense of what's going on in the regulatory agencies in the executive branch, for which the President is the only elected official and the only one to be held accountable for what happens. So you at least have to know what's happening, if not influence its outcome. But there was a lot of effort and a lot of thought and a lot of hard work, and I see a couple of people in the room here who were part of that process in coming up with 12866 to replace 12291. And I remember in particular the time that we spent in trying to find the right word to emphasize the importance of thinking about benefits or costs that could not be quantified or monetized. And we thought of things like valuable, desirable. We finally resorted to the use of a thesaurus and came up with essential. And that was what we were looking for, that even if you can't quantify and monetize, it's essential to consider these costs and, most importantly, benefits. We also focused an inordinate amount of attention on outweigh. The Reagan order was benefits outweigh costs, and people said, whoa, that sounds like there's some precision involved. It's like mathematically possible to have scales, that you can do this with some degree of sophistication. And after a long time, we came up with justify. Benefits should justify the costs. We also emphasized that the agencies were the repositories of the substantive expertise. If you read 12866 carefully, you'll see that that is mentioned twice in the first two paragraphs. Emphasis on that syllable was important. It limited review. Under Reagan, it had been to look at everything. Under Clinton, it was only to look at those that were significant. The definition of significant gave some people some issues, but that was important. In fact, it made OIRA more important because it was focusing all of its energies on just the most important things rather than squandering time on things that were less consequential. And we did a lot with transparency and accountability. Now, we did not win everybody over, to be sure. The most progressive groups continued to object to the use of cost-benefit analysis. And while I recognize that their concerns were not unfounded, I deeply regretted the fact that the strategic, tactical decision by most of these groups was to withdraw from the playing field. And that had a very interesting consequence, which Ricky Revesz has written about, I guess Ricky and Michael Livermore, and that is they ceded the field to the proponents of cost-benefit analysis, and there was no pushback from those who wanted to have a somewhat more conscious restraint to use this for information rather than as dispositive of a decision. They just were not there, and I think that was unfortunate. The other challenge that I faced, and I'd be interested in Howard's views on this, is that we were in a Democratic administration, an administration that wanted to aggressively regulate, particularly after 12 years of Reagan-Bush. And I guess me personally, but also our office, was viewed with a great deal of skepticism by a lot of the regulatory agencies. There were some cabinet members who thought that we were standing in the way of accomplishing Clinton's agenda, or of nitpicking or overanalyzing proposals when the job was just to make it happen. And that led to a certain tension in a Democratic administration, which I think is not apparent, at least to me, in a Republican administration where the contributions of the Office of OIRA are more generally appreciated. My last takeaway from those years is that even while we were developing much better techniques for cost-benefit analysis, and a lot of work was done by a lot of sentient intelligence on how to monetize some of these consequences of rulemaking, we discovered that there were areas outside of environmental and health and safety where there was very little consensus. There was very little thought being given to how do you quantify and then monetize privacy. And that was the first one, I think, that hit us as, oh my, how do we go about doing that one? And the other issue that arose was security. Even before 9/11, there was a great concern about how you harden some sites, but then we're not dealing with a static situation. Terrorists are smart. You harden one site, they go for another, conceivably, or at least the analysis should reflect that possibility. How do you accomplish that? And this is well before there was the Department of Homeland Security, which some of my colleagues have had to deal with. But it was nonetheless quite concerning how to take the very well-developed and thoughtful analyses from the environmental health and safety areas and translate them or apply them in this area. But I think we left cost-benefit analysis and OIRA in good shape, if it was a little short-staffed, for John. John?
Sally always teased me up so well. I love it. Let me just start with a little history to carry on with her reflections. When I became OIRA administrator, Republican administration, you always look at the executive order. Do you want to have your own executive order? And I refer to it as Sally's executive order. She calls it the Clinton executive order. But my boss and I looked at it and we said, this looks fine to us. We think we can do all sorts of mischief with this executive order. But in fairness, we thought it was fine. And we worked with that executive order without difficulty. And indeed, I vividly remember Mitch Daniels, my boss at the time, telling me, John, you have the authority if I want you to do it. You don't have the authority if I don't want you to do it. And it was a pretty simple explanation of what the issues were. Then I wanted to remind you that 9/11 occurred several months after my confirmation. And here I thought I was coming into a conservative, deregulatory administration. And I want to tell you, the people I was dealing with on a day-to-day basis, man, they completely changed colors. Because they had all kinds of regulatory ambitions. And the one that I remember vividly was, as you know, many of the terrorists got into the United States through our higher education system in this country. And in some sympathy to my colleagues, a lot of these colleges and universities didn't have any clue where a number of these students, so-called students, had gotten in and where they were, or they were on leave somewhere or whatever. But nonetheless, the solutions that were being batted about in my administration were hardly kind of, freedom-respecting and at least disruptive kind of solutions. We were talking about banning foreign students and banning foreign faculty members and all of this without any cost-benefit analysis. And of course, we had no idea how to do cost-benefit analysis on terrorism regulations at the time. And I'm pleased there's been some work on that since then. But that was the environment that I was immediately inserted into. And I have a lot of tire tracks on my chest from Homeland Security regulations that didn't have any cost-benefit analysis behind them. But I am pleased to note, for those of you who've been traveling, pre-check. Pre-check was the kind of idea that OIRA was trying to put in, and we were viewed as really unsympathetic with the need for the president to take extremely strong action on Homeland Security issues. Let me transition from history to a few more general comments about regulatory analysis and OIRA. I know we have some people in the room who are not deeply familiar with the structure of the U.S. government, and I want to remind all of you that OIRA is really a policy-making unit as much as a policy analysis unit. And in this way, it contrasts with the Congressional Budget Office, I think a very influential and effective organization in Washington that advises the Congress. I say that because the title of this session refers to regulatory analysis, but there are a lot of things that OIRA does that are policy-making oriented. For example, we are assigned by Sally's executive order to make sure that what the agencies are doing is what are presidential priorities. And if these agencies are off doing things that are not president's priorities, that's a problem. And it's the job of OIRA to make sure that that does not happen. A second point to remind you of is that we have the various agencies. We have Energy and EPA and Interior, and these agencies don't always agree with each other. And they fight with each other, and at some point, sometimes you have to get them together and say, we're going to resolve this issue and we're going to do something. Okay? Well, OIRA has an important role to play in forcing that kind of resolution, and that is a central aspect of this exercise. The second point I wanted to make is OIRA is very much a creature of OMB culture. And for those of you who study European institutions, you know that Treasury and budget are oftentimes in the same ministry. But the United States is somewhat unusual in that you separate the revenue raising from the spending. So think of OMB culture as these are people who are worried about whether we're spending money wisely. That's a nice way to say it. Or you could say they're bean counters, these bean counters at OMB, right? Nonetheless, this is the culture of OMB. So regulation within OMB, it's just seen as another way to spend money. Instead of spending the taxpayers' money, you're spending the state and local government's money or the business's money or a nonprofit organization. Whoever you're regulating, you're telling them you got to do these things. And if it's not money, it's resources more generally that you're forcing them to spend. So just like agency budgetary expenditures require justification at OMB, OIRA says regulations require justification. And I raise this point because in the current administration, where the regulatory budget idea is trying to be actually implemented in some meaningful fashion, the idea of the 2-for-1, which seems like kind of a political gimmick kind of thing, if you read the way the OMB guidance has tried to professionalize this, it's actually unfolding as something like a regulatory budget. And it's very much natural within OMB culture to think this way. Regardless of whether you agree with it or disagree with it, I want you to see how it's a natural way for OMB to think about these issues. Third point I wanted to make is regulatory analysis is at least as much a decision supporting exercise as a decision-informing exercise. And this is a way for me to confess that my experience when I was in the government is oftentimes the politicians and the lawyers, they go off in a corner and they decide what the regulation is going to be. And then they go to the analysts and the agencies, now develop us a regulatory analysis that will support this. And they get on the phone and they call their consulting firm that does regulatory analysis. We need an analysis to support this position. Unfortunately, this is oftentimes the way regulatory analysis works in the federal government. It doesn't mean that it's actually useless. In many cases, regulatory analysis of this form in the legal culture that we're in, it provides an important foundation to either defend or to expose the weaknesses in the agency's position, which is ultimately addressed through litigation. The other point I wanted to make here is that The legal and political cultures of the executive branch are very strong, and I experience them as much stronger than economic tradition and economic reasoning. So you have to go in as a person who's trained from an economic orientation, understand that you're just kind of like one voice out there and you're trying to make some contributions and this sort of thing. Modest expectations, you're not trying to like run the whole enterprise. So for example, you think, oh, pollution's a problem, we'll tax it instead of regulating it. I mean, everybody knows taxes are a much more effective way to deal with pollution than regulation. Only problem is it's illegal and no elected official will want to do the tax. But other than that, it's not a problem at all. Fourth point, discipline of regulatory analysis applies to acts of deregulation as much as acts of regulation. And I'm only beginning to read some of the documents coming out of the early deregulatory actions within this administration. And without trying to be too specific or anything, I just want to give you a historical example to make the point. In 1980, Ronald Reagan ran on a platform of regulatory relief. He referred to the misery index, double-digit rates of inflation, unemployment, and interest. And he went to Detroit and he pledged that we would get rid of all these regulations on the car industry, including one dear to my heart, which is the requirement of automobile airbags in new cars. My doctoral dissertation happened to be on that subject at the time. The Department of Transportation and OIRA, they got together, they followed through with the presidential priority, and they eliminated this regulation. I mean, he won the election, right? I mean, we're in a democracy, right? No. No, no, no. The problem was there wasn't evidence in the record to support this decision as defined by the Administrative Procedure Act. State Farm Insurance Company, who had worked this issue hard for over 20 years, was not just going to roll over because Ronald Reagan was elected. And they sued, and they won. 9-0 on the airbag portion of the State Farm case. And if you read carefully that opinion, they cite in the opinion variety of pieces of evidence from what? The regulatory impact analysis that had been done previously. So the important point I'm making here is that deregulation, you have to go through all the same processes and justifications, and it's not that easy. And I'm willing to bet this administration is not going to win a bunch of these deregulations they're talking about because it's very hard to support and defend a lot of this deregulation. 5, regulatory analysts need disproportionate focus on rulemakings with big economic impacts. I think one of the limitations of the Administrative Procedure Act is it envisions this same idea for all rulemakings, big rulemakings and little rulemakings. You have a notice of proposed rulemaking, you take comment, and then you go to a final rulemaking. But wait a minute, if this one over here is a $1 billion job and this one's a $10 million job, shouldn't we make sure we get the $10 billion one right? I'm sorry, that's OMB thinking, right? Bean counter thinking. There's proposals in this area. In the Senate, there's a very modest proposal right now to go to 3-step rulemaking for big rulemakings. So you start with an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, and you take comment on the problem definition and the data quality issues. Okay, then if you feel comfortable after that, you go to the proposed rule where you lay out what you want to do and what some of the other alternatives were you considered, and then you go to a final rule. It's actually through a committee in the Senate. It has a nice bipartisan vote behind it. I have no idea whether they'll get their act together to pass it, but it's very modest and I think a very sensible idea. Final point I want is that regulatory analysis is increasingly tied to international trade issues. And I think that OIRA as an institution in its future is going to find itself increasingly becoming an arm of the U.S. foreign policy, not just of domestic policy. And this is very unusual for OMB. Most people don't think of OMB as having kind of a foreign policy or international orientation. Under George W. Bush, this occurred because we came to the sobering realization that trying to resolve a lot of these issues in the World Trade Organization was not a very effective strategy. Both because you don't win all the cases, but even when you win, the remedies are so weak, and it takes so long, and at the end game, it's not clear that there are solutions there. So we spent a lot of time trying to begin to dialogue with Europe and to develop a common approach to regulation with the Europeans. The Obama administration, I think, worked on this even harder. They tried to actually develop this as part of the so-called, I think, TTIP treaty it was called, where you would actually have a treaty that would involve eliminating a lot of these non-tariff barriers. In the Trump administration, you see the beginnings of this as they're working on the redo of NAFTA. And a lot of people don't think of NAFTA as related to regulation. Well, let me tell you, when you get into the details of it, that's what this negotiation is all about. I think there's a particularly important need to work on the European relationships because of the interdependence of our economies and our shared stages of economic development. So one practical way to think about that is if the US and Europe can agree on a regulatory approach or a deregulatory approach, then it's much less likely that China or the developing countries will run off and do something completely off the reservation. But if Europe and the US are doing different things, then you're basically inviting the rest of the world to do something different. And then imagine you're a business trying to do sell your products all around the world. You've really got a proliferation problem in terms of those conflicting systems. Final point I want to do is give credit to the Obama administration, who worked very hard on the US-Europe problem. And I think that in the final analysis, the politics in Congress weren't there to generate a bipartisan vote to do something like TTIP, but the substance of what they are doing, I think, is very important, and in the future, I hope we'll make more progress. Thank you very much.
Okay, is this on? I was in the same administration as John, so I won't go over that, other than to say that I too have tire marks on the Homeland Security stuff, as well as one difference that we have and that Howard and I share is that we were there at the end of an administration, and the midnight regulation phenomena is strong. So the pressure to regulate, Sally suggested that perhaps a Republican administration didn't face that same pressure to be kind of holding back floodgates. We were, especially in the midnight period. But what I thought I would talk about is ask the question of whether OIRA has abandoned benefit cost analysis. We've seen this, the Trump administration come in with a big deregulatory focus. In the first year working with Congress, they overturned 15 regulations that were issued at the end of the Obama administration. And as we've been talking about in several of the previous panels, President Trump, within the first 2 weeks of office, issued Executive Order 13771. And that required what John mentioned, that for every new regulation, agencies have to identify 2 to remove. And we can talk about that more if people are interested. And also, an incremental regulatory budget constraint. And so in addition to the 2-for-1, which I think is not going to be binding at all, just because of the way it's been defined, the more binding part is that the cost of new regulatory activities have to be offset by removing or modifying existing regulations of equal or greater cost. So the people in previous panels have noted that Executive Order 13771 doesn't mention benefits at all. It talks about costs of regulations and it doesn't talk about benefits. So does that mean, is there a role for benefit cost analysis? And to that I would say enthusiastically, yes, there definitely still is. And I think that we have OIRA largely to thank for that. So it was the OIRA staff, the people that all of us have worked with, who issued guidance within a few weeks of that executive order being issued, and that guidance made very clear that, in fact, I'm just going to read you a little bit of it. It says, except where prohibited by law, agencies must continue to assess and consider both the benefits and costs of regulatory actions, including deregulatory actions, when making regulatory decisions, and issue regulations only upon a reasoned determination that benefits justify costs. So that was the language that Sally mentioned in the Sally executive order. In a subsequent Trump executive order, Sally's executive order is explicitly referenced. The executive order that requires agencies to have a team, a regulatory reform officer and a team focused on looking at regulations that, you know, how to comply with the 2-for-1 executive order, also mentions complying with Executive Order 12866 and the Obama Executive Order 13563. So if we have an abandoned benefit cost analysis, what is the meaning and what is the purpose of this budget constraint that's overlaid on top of the benefit cost requirements. Because if we have perfect information, and when I say we, I mean I'm no longer in the government, but if government regulators have perfect information and perfect incentives, decisions about where to regulate and where not to regulate should be decided based on net benefits. That should allocate resources to their best use. And a budget would either be non-binding or it would be harmful because it would disallow regulations that could have offered net benefits, but we can't get those social benefits because of the budget constraint. And I think the answer to that, the answer of why, is because we don't have perfect information nor perfect incentives. On the information front, Hayek's knowledge problem. As a government, we can never have the information that the dispersed people in society have. And also that we don't have perfect incentives for all the reasons that the Public Choice School of Economics and Political Economy point out. So if the budget constraint is able to counter these factors that may lead to over-regulation, I think it could improve regulatory outcomes and could improve benefit cost analysis in the process. For the first time, I think agencies have a real incentive to examine the impacts of existing regulations. Now, every president, I'll go back to Carter, Sally, going back to President Carter's executive order. Going back to that executive order, presidents have said, and don't just apply this benefit cost analysis to new regulations that you're considering, but apply it retrospectively, examine the regulations on the books, and see if they are achieving the net benefits that you predicted. And yet, despite that, and President Obama issued more of those executive orders and put an even greater emphasis on that than I think previous presidents had. And despite that, we still don't write regulations with a plan for how we'll review them, and we still aren't doing a good job of that retrospective review. In fact, on the panel, I don't know how many of you were in the panel in the amphitheater this morning of senior agency staff responsible for implementing these executive orders. And they noted that for the first time, that they're actually reviewing the CFR. They're going through the Code of Federal Regulations, looking at regulations and saying, gosh, these are outdated. We don't need these. This is a costless thing to remove. So I think if it forces a clear-eyed evaluation of regulatory impacts, it can improve our ex-ante assumptions too, because if we never look back and test the hypotheses that we made in doing those ex-ante RIAs, or benefit cost analyses, we're never learning to improve them. So I think it could improve ex-ante, and that counts for the benefits as well as the costs. It's not just a cost exercise. Are we achieving the benefits that we had hoped to achieve? And I think that it'll improve the analysis and it'll improve regulatory outcomes. And I thought that was really clear from the agency panel earlier. They're all, I was really impressed with the officials. They're taking this very seriously and constructively. That doesn't mean that there aren't challenges ahead. As John mentioned, the judicial review, I think judicial review is going to be even more challenging for deregulatory initiatives than it is for regulatory initiatives, which anyone who works in an agency knows is already very challenging. So I think dotting your I's and crossing your T's, doing that analysis is going to be essential. And it is just hard to measure the benefits and costs of regulations that are on the books. It's no easier. You'd think, well, now we have data, we should be able to look back and see whether we were right. No, because we still don't know what the world would have looked like if we hadn't. And these are all challenges that the panel of experts yesterday, I think, also raised very nicely. Although one of the cute remarks I heard on the previous panel was, this is an intellectually stimulating exercise, that for the first time they're doing it and they're taking it in that constructive way. I also learned that OIRA has new guidance out on how to do that, so I didn't read that in time. I think that, so those are the more positive things that could happen. Alternatively, it may just slow down the pace of new regulations, and we've seen a lot of that, of course, in the first year. But the potential is, if it can counter those political economy pressures and shift some resources perhaps from ex ante to ex post. What somebody on an earlier panel, I'm not naming names, but you know who I'm talking about, you referred to as prospective retrospective analysis. I think that could be really valuable, and what agencies will be doing is focusing on maximizing net benefits within that budget constraint. One of the agency officials earlier today said, our job is, where we're focusing is reducing the regulatory burden without affecting the safety goal, which is our mission. The other thing that the panelists earlier said was that the unified agenda of regulatory and deregulatory actions that's issued twice a year has more meaning and more teeth than it's had in the past, and it's bringing economists along with scientists and others into the regulatory development process earlier, because at an earlier stage you have to make estimates of what the impacts are going to be. That was a benefit that I actually hadn't thought about before. On the downside, they noted that there's a stickiness to those estimates. So you do these preliminary estimates, and that's a good thing, but then when you get further down the road, you're kind of stuck with the estimates that you had, and so that could be a drawback. So I think I'm going to end on a somewhat optimistic note about just kind of reiterate, I think, that emphatically benefit cost analysis is still an essential part of OIRA's role and of the regulatory process. And now Howard will rebut everything I just said.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I don't think I'll start by rebutting everything Susan said. First of all, one does that at one's peril. I don't think I want to rebut all of it. But a few other points just to start with, and some of them relate to what Sally and John have already said. I think one of the things that's important to recognize about OIRA is never exactly the same from administration to administration. It certainly has a very stiff spine through the executive orders, and what I think has come to be now over 5 administrations a really firm acceptance and embeddedness of the executive orders. But there's some real differences in the institutional setting of OIRA within any administration that I think affect the extent to which OIRA is a policy-making organization versus a policy-analyzing organization, an organization designed to provide defense to regulations, or an organization designed to retrofit good analysis to the policies the government wishes to go forward with. And I think one could probably see, if one really bears down, a real difference, for example, in the reporting relationships that an OIRA administrator has within the executive branch, the role that the OMB director plays as opposed to policy council heads or people in the chief of staff's office vis-a-vis OIRA. I think those things differ quite a bit. I would say, at least I was there for President Obama's second term, and by that point OIRA was well established after Cass's 3 years during the first term. Cass had a very close relationship with the president, a very close kind of access directly into the West Wing, and he was there for a period that spanned a couple of different OMB directors, one of them who exited relatively early, the other of whom then became chief of staff. The result was that the OMB director, I think in the Obama administration, played a little bit of less of a role vis-a-vis OIRA than was the case in other administrations, and that I sense, only from the outside, there's no way to really know this, is the sense in the current administration. When I came in 2013, I followed very quickly on the heels of a brand new OMB director, Sylvia Burwell, who was there for about a year before she moved over to HHS, and then Sean Donovan came in. So because of that shifting, the reporting relationship that I had was sort of a dotted line and keeping in the loop through a weekly meeting with the OMB director, but actually more directly working in with the policy councils and with a regular meeting in the Chief of Staff's office every week. That had a lot to do with the role that we played. I'd say there was, in some sense, more pressure in specific instances to find a solution. Get involved early. We want to do this. Don't just keep saying no. So that put OIRA a bit in the policy-making apparatus that was sometimes uncomfortable, to be perfectly honest. I never felt it was my job to tell Gina McCarthy, you should have this priority, not that priority, and I pity the fool who tries, if you know Gina. She's one of my heroes, a fantastic, brilliant administrator, very hard-headed person. So it was a way of sort of being involved early on and trying to say, here are the roadblocks you're going to face. Here are the analytic hurdles that you are going to have to overcome. And the offsetting side of that, and the really good part of that, was very firm backing from across the West Wing to do our job. I think there was a recognition that if OIRA does its job, rules are going to be more durable. They're more likely to pass judicial review. You're more likely to be able to go out and defend them on really solid grounds against what we knew was going to be quite a bit of pushback against some of the regulatory initiatives that the president had and that the different departments had. So there wasn't a very easy ability for a cabinet secretary to go around OIRA. There was really a sort of a stop, go back and see OIRA. If you can't work it out, come see us. Similarly, this gets also to something John said, where agencies would have tensions, and this happened not at all infrequently. Again, it was not viewed as the job of somebody in the West Wing to resolve that dispute. It was really all pushed back to OIRA. And only if we could not come to resolution there would issues elevate, which was a failure for everybody. Nobody wanted to be seen as unable to reach resolution below the Chief of Staff's office. There had to be a very clear and good reason before you elevated. So I felt like we had very good backing in playing that role, what Cass in his writings has described as the convening and sort of compromise role. So that was another commonality, I think, with the role that John saw while he was there. So there is both a policy making and a policy analysis role, but I really think the policy analysis role is fundamental, and the policy making role only comes through as sort of an adjunct or a corollary to what the analysis can bring. Let's see, a couple of other things about the nature of cost-benefit analysis and how I saw that evolve. Look, there remain two, I think, really critical problems that one faces day to day in OIRA. One is how to deal with things that you can't quantify, whether they be costs or benefits, and I think you have to have a theory or a philosophy about how you are going to handle those. You can try to quantify anything, and as an economist, I love to try to quantify everything, but there's a point at which your quantification efforts really are not terribly credible. And I think that there has to be a realization of when you have forced quantification beyond the point where it's terribly persuasive. And so the question is, what do you do in those circumstances where you have an essential interest that is not a quantifiable interest, whether that's on the cost side or far more common on the benefit side? And so I think that one of the things that is incumbent on any OIRA administrator is to think about that problem and come to at least a theory of the case. You could throw up your hands and say, like some people, mostly progressive groups, but not exclusively, have done, and say, you can never quantify this stuff. You can never get a handle on the benefits. Your cost-benefit analysis is inexorably biased. You shouldn't do it. I strongly disagree with that position, and I hope that anyone who ever runs OIRA will strongly disagree with that position. They shouldn't be confirmed if they don't. But the question is, what do you do in that circumstance? And I think the solution that we came to was really this. First of all, there is always value in quantifying the costs, always. My view is even in those statutes that say the agency must act without regard to cost, something about our democratic process benefits when it says in the RIA, this rule is costing society X. We're doing it because there's a really big benefit. You can describe that benefit qualitatively and say two things about it. Or three things about it. One is, we think it's an essential benefit. It's a good thing to do. Two, it is legal to pursue this benefit. It is within the ambit of authority that Congress has granted the agency. Three, the regulation is well designed to achieve that benefit. If you can say those three things and put that opposite a quantified cost, you've then given the public a very clear explanation of why we're doing the rule, that we can do the rule, why the rule is being done in the particular way it's doing, and here are what the costs are. And then it can go to a more democratic process of whether or not we want this rule. That is where Congress can come in and say, they have the authority to do it, but we actually disagree. And if you go back to a lot of regulations, you can see that the benefit quantification is either incredibly partial. It only gets to part of what is essential about the rule. And so we should have a clear explanation of why else we're doing the rule, that we can do it and that we're likely to achieve the goal. And there are other rules where the quantification is just not really credible or clear. I'll give you an example. What is the value of the life of a right whale? I don't know. I like right whales. I like all whales. Whales are wonderful. They have like huge psychic value to me. I get depressed if there aren't whales in the world, and if there's one fewer, I'm a little bit depressed. I can't quantify that. I can't quantify what the social value of a whale is. I do know that I had a rule from NOAA that said we are going to impose costs, significant costs, on ships coming into shipping channels, and possibly costs in the form of reduced maneuverability of ships coming into the shipping channels that, per the Coast Guard, could create accidents. And we are going to do this to preserve the lives of right whales that might be struck by ships coming into the ship channels. How do you do that cost and benefit in any way that passes the laugh test? Well, you know, there is a value of statistical life of a right whale. I'm sure of it. I have no idea what it is. And I have looked deeply at the literature, and I can find nothing that gives me much of a clue. But what we could do is explain what the costs of this rule would be in terms of slower movement of ships into port, possible reduced maneuverability, because you actually have reduced maneuverability below 10 knots to get out of the way of an oncoming ship, and there had been numerous close calls, data we got from the Coast Guard, and those accidents are really expensive, and I do know what the value of statistical life of a sailor is. So we were able to quantify the costs and potential costs of this rule quite considerably. On the other side of it, we have the value of preserving habitat and the lives of right whales. So what we did is we explained what the purpose of the rule was, that it was a legitimate purpose that NOAA had, and that the rule was, at least according to some evidence, likely to achieve its benefit. But we were unsure about that, actually, and we were also concerned about the cost. So in that rule, we actually did prospective retrospective. We required NOAA to state that after 5 years, they would look at how many right whales had been in the channel, how many near misses there had been, what on the other side had happened in terms of near misses among ships, and that they would reconsider the rule at that time. So I think that there is a way to put incommensurate things on different sides of the cost-benefit analysis balance, and I don't think you have to quantify everything to be true to the executive orders and to do a good analysis. You know, someone referred to exposing weaknesses in regulations. A lot of what we are there to do is explain why we're doing the rule and let people decide if it's worth it. So a good regulatory impact analysis doesn't have to have quantification of everything, and that's why I think the word justify is so important. Justify, I think, brings in that nature of dignitary and other interests. So the one thing, though, that I want to say makes, as Sally said, OIRA a bit unpopular in democratic administrations is a relentless insistence, even if you can't quantify the benefits, of quantifying the costs and doing so accurately so there can be the proper consideration of whether, even if OIRA thinks so and society doesn't, there is a mechanism that we can see what we're paying to achieve this unquantified benefit. Just a couple of other quick things. On regulation versus deregulation, I think we all agree on this panel that both strongly benefit from cost-benefit analysis. I also largely agree with what Susan has said about the likely impact of the Trump executive orders. In fact, Executive Order 13777, which creates these teams within the agencies to do deregulation, I loved that when I read it. I said, God, we would have issued that in the Obama administration if we could have gotten them to. I mean, this is, it says all the right things. It's exactly what President Obama was trying to do through Executive Order 13610 and the retrospective review initiatives that we put in place. And it just spelled it out more broadly. In fact, there was sort of a soft effort to create these teams. We actually did find career people in each agency that were accountable for generating those twice-yearly reports to OIRA that would list the rules that the agencies were reviewing for retrospective review and that would identify rules for repeal or reform. We actually went through several hundred such rules in the almost 4 years that I was there, which was really the point when this executive order started to kick into gear. And we, by our calculation, had saved on a 5-year window $38 billion in regulatory costs through that initiative. And I was pleased that a very conservative organization that usually used to attack us said, actually, you guys may have underestimated how much you saved. Now, they wanted to do that to encourage us to keep doing it. But we did insist on rigorous cost-benefit analysis. So here's my only concern, and it's not so much a rebuttal. I think that you can say one thing in an executive order and do something very different in an agency. I think you can have really good agency officials trying to do the right thing and agency leadership that reads those executive orders very differently. Yeah, all that nice stuff about cost, benefits, and analysis. At the end of the day, it's going to be a scorecard. How many rules did I get off? In fact, they're so desperate for a scorecard in this administration that they're counting guidance documents as regulations that have been repealed. That is not beneficial to society and to stakeholders. Repealing guidance documents is, by and large, with the exception of those few abusive guidance documents that really are regulations in disguise, guidance documents are good things. You pull those things down, you make life more difficult for stakeholders. So I worry a little bit that when you move to a scorecard kind of notion, that what you're really going to do is, despite what all the good work that goes on down in the agencies, you're going to get people running roughshod over that when it comes to the political decisions. So to me, the real question is, and this is a question for OIRA today, and one can only hope, and I think there's some evidence, that OIRA is fighting the good fight inside this administration. It is fighting the good fight on behalf of those people in the agencies trying to do the rigorous cost-benefit analysis on the deregulatory actions. All you can do as an OIRA administrator is fight the good fight as high up as they'll let you, to give the bad news as long as you can, and eventually you're likely to be overruled. I mean, there are a handful of rules where I sat there and I said, this is madness. And I was told by people far more highly ranked than I was, we love this madness. Go away. And then you have to go back to your wonderful staff and say, we lost. But that's okay. We tried. We fought. We delivered the information. So I guess the question is, how is OIRA fighting that fight? I think so. How far up can the administrator get a hearing and be involved in those decisions? If it's not very high up, then I worry that all the really good stuff in 13777 that Obama would have put in there, I don't think we would have changed a word in what's in there. Is it actually being lived up to? And I think that's something that we're going to have to see over time. Final thing is on midnight regulations. That's going to be a problem, administration in, administration out. Cabinet secretaries, presidents, everybody, policy council heads, all will start to get close to the end of an administration and say, what did I really want to do that I didn't get done? And they're going to rush your doors at OIRA. we had a list that you can't believe. And basically what we did is we had a really very concerted process that started almost 18 months out from the end of the administration of requiring every agency to rate their remaining regs, identify the regs they wanted to do, to tell us what the top 10 were, and then to rate them by high priority, middle priority, low priority. We then cross-reference that with and this gets to John's policy-making point, with the policy councils, the chief of staff's office, came up with sort of the Venn diagram of what people in the White House really cared about and people in the agencies really cared about, and made those the priority rules, having everybody understand that if you don't get those across, they may wind up on the cutting room floor, because we weren't going to shorten review periods and serious reviews as we move towards the end of the administration. And I like to think, in large part, I know what got left on the cutting room floor. It was a lot. I like to think that we did a pretty good job in managing that process, but it is a very tough process, and it's going to happen regardless of politics. And just one final note on international trade. Obama issued Executive Order 13609, really important because it put OIRA right into the middle of regulatory harmonization and trade efforts. John mentioned TTIP. It was very interesting. I spent a lot of time with USTR, went on lots of trips to Brussels with Mike Froman to sit down with the regulatory counterparts in DG Trade at the European Commission to try to work out a lot of regulatory process things. And it was just very interesting to see how on a specific regulation you could get harmonization and get lined up, but on process, like when a rule's text would be made available to stakeholders, when you would have an RIA that would be made available, really, really hard to line up the processes between the two jurisdictions, and it wound up being quite a roadblock. I think we made a lot of progress towards the end, but as John said, it became pretty clear about a year out that Congress had no appetite for TTIP, and that sort of backed off. But I think we will see OIRA playing a very important role in all of these trade reforms going forward.
Let's go straight to, well, maybe.
I have a couple things I'd love to discuss.
Okay, so we'll have time for questions in just a minute, but right now we will like to have a little bit more back and forth among the panelists. So.
Yeah. First of all, I think it is noteworthy how much agreement there is among former administrators from both Republican and Democratic administrations. Very, very little disagreement. I think Howard is correct that the power, authority of the office is highly dependent on the relationship between the administrator and others in the administration. In my day, we didn't really take much account of anything across West Executive Avenue. What happened in the West Wing happened in the West Wing. We ran our own show. I had, I think, one meeting with the Chief of Staff on a reg that was contested, and one meeting with the President under the resolution, dispute resolution in the executive order. Otherwise, as you put it, it was my job to resolve issues, to solve problems. That changed over time so that now there's a very different relationship. I think I do disagree with the prevalent optimism of some of my co-panelism about the current state of affairs.
This is why we love to be on a panel together.
And, you know, I often describe myself as the skunk at the picnic. But I am concerned that benefits will not get a fair shake in this administration. I do not see any decisional criteria in any of the executive orders or pronouncements that thou shalt not get rid of a rule that has demonstrably higher benefits, greater benefits that outweigh or justify the minuscule costs associated therewith. The idea is tally the costs. And even though there's references to benefits, there's no decisional criteria that don't tamper with things that have been good for society. And maybe I'm unduly pro-regulatory, but that part bothers me. The other thing that was not discussed that I think ties together the analysis with the policy is what do you do in cases of uncertainty? And there's different kinds of uncertainty. There's uncertainty because you don't have enough data. There's uncertainty because the data just dance all over the place. What's your fallback? Are you going to be willing to regulate? Are you going to defer regulation? That's the policy component that goes with the analytical component that I think OIRA does play a role in. And I just wanted to clarify that.
Just a quick comment on midnight regulations. I often will show a chart of the number of regulations issued at the end of every, or across time. And you'll see every 8 years the spike of, and ask my students, what do you think was going on then? And then I have to sheepishly show them my spike. So despite our best efforts, but I also tell them, you should have seen the ones that might have gone if we hadn't been there. So that's something OIRA always says, but you should see what it looked like before we hit it. I agree with Sally and Howard that OIRA's role changes a little bit, but I think maybe the more important thing is that it doesn't change a lot, and that I think it ensures continuity across administrations, and in part because the directives, the requirements that Reagan put in place and Sally continued with Executive Order 12866 does ensure the analysis, and it does add that sort of level of integrity. So there is a lot of discussion with the folks in the West Wing. OIRA is a staff of career staff, many of whom have been there for decades. And the West Wing staff, they might come in thinking, well, it's all based on politics and I know the answer to everything, but they really do end up realizing that listening to those bunch of bean counters in OIRA is valuable. So I think that's important.
Howard or John, do you want to? All right, so let's turn it open to audience for questions. If you have a question, you should come up to the microphones, and I'll again mention that if you're in the other room, you should come into this room and ask questions. And finally, I'll actually kick it off. I kind of warned you guys that I might do this, is that while we've been talking about regulations, of course, across the program here, we have all sorts of examples of benefit cost analyses of all sorts of different areas, sort of more of the traditional cost benefit analysis of infrastructure, as well as, newer ones about social policy and education policy. And I was wondering what lessons we might get if we could have, other than coming up with a nice pronounceable acronym like OIRA, if we had an Office of Information and Infrastructure Affairs, which I can't quite pronounce, or Education Policy Affairs, what kinds of lessons might we've learned more broadly from your experiences as OIRA? Thanks.
Well, one thought, I think to a certain extent OMB may serve that purpose. But I also think that there are lessons that we in the regulatory world can learn from those of you who do social policy and on programs that are funded through the budget. And that is, you do a much better job of looking at the actual impact of your programs. So you do a lot better ex post. There are program evaluation offices in every agency. There aren't regulatory evaluation offices. So I think the learning can go both ways.
Yeah, I would say that the use of analysis in any decision-making is valuable. So I would apply it beyond rule-making itself to any kind of policy initiative, including particularly infrastructure. I mean, analysis is good, but the interagency process that I think Susan was talking about or John was talking about, that was invaluable to bring different people to the table to provide information which isn't necessarily within the CBA or BCA box, informs analysis, informs decision-making is invaluable. It's fabulous.
So thank you all for that. That was really interesting. I think one of the things that OIRA cares most about, and the people in this room care most about, is getting the economic analysis right. And we have excellent executive orders to get cost-benefit analysis right, and A4, which is so good it's actually taught in schools around the country. However, the benefit analysis, it's true, the benefit analysis is often held hostage to poorly designed risk assessments, and there is no executive order and there is no A4 for risk assessments. And John, you tried to do something about this. I would say it didn't work as well as you had hoped. I'm wondering what could be done to help on that front.
We started there was a skeletal risk assessment principles that was done during Clinton with the fabulous help of Joe Stiglitz, who was at CEA. God bless him. I mean, we couldn't have done some of this without him. But then, Susan, didn't you you upped the ante? I thought you redid the risk assessment and brought it to real life, just like John took my little A4, which was a mere shadow of its current form, but you could read it without falling asleep. And you turned it into something which I always use when I have problems sleeping at night.
Yes, I want to respond to the question because I think that it's important to remember that there are disciplinary differences between what economists want from risk assessment to deliver for the kinds of analyses that they want to do and what toxicologists and epidemiologists and other physical scientists think that risk assessment is about. And these differences have not been adequately bridged in the academic literature. And one of the things I often emphasize when I talk to people who are interested in OIRA kind of guidance documents, for OIRA to write a guidance document that's kind of like out of the zone of where the academic literature is not a particularly good thing. So I think on the particular question that just was asked, this society, for example, might sponsor some dialogues where they bring together economists and engineers and physical scientists and talk through the issues, because I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done before you can get the kind of guidance document that is implicit, I think, in the question that was just asked.
Yeah, and Richard, just to very briefly add to what John said, I agree with that completely. And there are a whole lot of just fundamental questions on which there is not consensus or a good roadmap for the government, never mind OIRA specifically, how to deal with improbable but cataclysmic outcomes in the analysis. There are a lot of ideas, there's a lot of debate in the literature. This comes up all the time in rulemaking. And so how we deal with, we sort of have better understanding of how to deal with uncertainty in our cost-benefit analysis than we do with risk because of different conceptualizations of risk, and just we don't have consensus or established principles and a guideline for how we deal with certain problems that seem to recur. So this would be a great project for this society and for any OIRA going forward.
Hi. Yesterday we heard a really interesting presentation on individualized medicine, and I'm wondering if you see any analogies in the terms of regulatory sphere, either in terms of the relationship between reg design and compliance, or perhaps in terms of the emphasis on distributional issues in the analysis. Sorry, left field.
Yeah, but it's a great question.
Yeah, I'll take a swing at it. In the end, regulations they can't be completely customized, right? The more you know about individualized effects, the more you can design a regulation that has more gradients of compliance obligation and have more provisions, if you will, that are more granularly tailored. So this is a two-part problem, right? One is understanding through the feedback mechanism of public notice and comment what those gradations are. What are the more subdivided or individualized needs of different stakeholders that are going to be affected by a rule? That is partly a technology issue in spreading both notice to people about a rule and collecting comment that is meaningful in a more widespread and granular way. There are actually some very interesting kinds of technological solutions that people have been working on so that you can actually get better feedback that allows you to see how the rule is going to affect different kinds of stakeholders. You then can embed something in the regulatory design that is somewhat more granular. But I think at the end of the day, for a rule to be implementable, for an RIA to be doable, there's going to be, even if broken down into reasonably small categories, a bit of one size fits all. So I think the analogy is going to be pretty incomplete. On distributional effects and distributional benefits, I put that into the category of things that might be non-quantifiable benefits. Yes, I can tell you how much money might be going somewhere, but in terms of what that does, in terms of equality, inclusiveness, things that is very hard to put a number on, we articulate that as a goal, we show the goal is legitimate, we show the rule will be able to achieve it, and then we say that we're achieving it at the lowest cost possible. If you can do that, I think you've got a good rule.
Thank you. I'm delighted to hear that you like the executive order that came out. For those of us who drafted it in the transition plan and the transition team, it was about the 15th version of it that finally got through. So it's not as though it came directly in one piece. But what I will show concern about is, for those of us who've been in the trenches of the administrative process, that many times the appointees are unaware of the administrative law aspects of regulatory development, and getting them to understand that if you have a deregulatory act, it may still be a substantial effect, it may be a major rule, and as such, and has to go through the process, and that doesn't make them very happy to hear. The other part of this, though, is that when you do a retrospective analysis, you've got to appreciate the fact that things have changed, science has moved forward, and therefore the benefits you thought you had, and the costs for that matter, are probably not correct. You were probably wrong. I've done one retrospective analysis, found that the costs were off some and the benefits were dramatically wrong. And so you end up with the need for what I think you've heard you say, a better understanding of what you call risk assessment. I think it's hazard assessment that's the more important element. And I think the place to put it is OSTP, where they have the potential to bring together the scientific community that can reevaluate the policies that we have, and critically important ones that drive the regulatory process. And that hasn't been done in many, many years and probably needs to be redone.
I think you're right. Often appointees come in and not aware of their expectations. And the president himself has said some rather outlandish things. Never one to try to underpromise. Even about regulation. Never one to underpromise and overdeliver. He said, for example, I actually started to have a slide that had him snipping the red tape between the 1960 Code of Federal Regulations and the current one, and he said, we're going to get back to 1960 levels, and we're going to do it pretty quickly. So it shows, he doesn't realize, as you said, the process, the administrative law process, that it takes just as much time and just as much analysis and as much public comment and probably more judicial review. But also all the main regulatory agencies were formed since 1960, so it's unreasonable. And the other part of I think it's related to Richard's comment. I do think that the health risk estimates and environmental risk estimates are the greatest uncertainties when we're doing regulation, and that if we could do a better job of narrowing those uncertainties, focusing on where are the biggest uncertainties and what research can we do to narrow them, I think that would be very important. And also John's point about it's just done for a different purpose, and it doesn't work in regulatory analysis. The numbers that come out of the risk assessments don't match the numbers that we need to do benefit cost analysis.
It might surprise you that I too agree with a lot of what you said in your comments. I remember we were very fortunate in the Clinton administration that we were able to set up a whole orientation for the regulatory people. And in the executive order, there's a regulatory working group that we met every couple of weeks to go over some of the basics of the applicable law and policy that goes into rulemaking. By the time I was doing transition for the Obama administration, the cabinet officials and the undersecretaries and the deputy secretaries and whatever were so anxious to get to their desks and start carrying out their objectives that they didn't have time. There was a one-day session at the Blair House that was set up, and we had an hour and a half, and we were going to talk about what is a regulation and how does it come about, and how do you hit. And you had cabinet secretaries and deputy secretaries peeling off to take emergency phone calls from their agencies, and there are 3 people left in the room to listen to this. I think it's exacerbated by this administration, which has attracted a lot of people who have no government experience. And if you're really good in the business world, you may not have great familiarity with the Administrative Procedure Act. And that may be a problem, and may account for some of the obtuseness that we see.
Hi, I'm Jack Wells. I served for 10 years as the chief economist at the U.S. Department of Transportation during the Bush and Obama administration. And I wanted to pick up on Don's question about the use of benefit cost analysis for other purposes such as policy analysis and infrastructure investment. A lot of us use benefit cost analysis, particularly for infrastructure investment. And we've never really gotten any support from OMB on that use of benefit cost analysis. In the Clinton administration in 1994, the president issued Executive Order 12893 that required benefit cost analysis for infrastructure investment, but OMB has never issued guidance on how to implement that executive order, so it's not clear, for example, whether it applies to all infrastructure investment or only projects above a certain threshold dollar amount, whether it applies to projects only to projects that are selected at the federal level, or whether it also applies to projects that are funded with federal money but are selected by state and local governments. So the result is that, as a practical matter, it's never been implemented. And when I was at DOT, I periodically would talk to people in OMB, could you give us some support on this? Because it's difficult for us to require our agencies to implement this unless they're getting some support from OMB that this really is a requirement. And clearly there are some problems with implementing this kind of requirement because many of our infrastructure programs are partnerships with state and local governments, so you have the element of requiring state and local governments to carry out benefit cost analysis. In the Obama administration, we did get support from the White House when the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act was passed, and we developed the Tiger Grant program and the high-speed rail program because the White House did insist that we require the use of benefit cost analysis for those programs. And we found, to our surprise, that most state and local governments were able to adopt that requirement and comply with it in a fairly reasonable way, and I think it dramatically improved the cost effectiveness of that program. And of course, another part of the problem is that while there's a clear organizational locus in OMB for the regulatory benefit cost analysis, there's no comparable organizational locus for infrastructure benefit cost analysis. So I wanted to sort of throw that issue back to you and ask for a little bit more comment on your part about what we can do to make infrastructure benefit cost analysis as thoroughgoing a part of the government process as regulatory benefit cost analysis is.
It's a great question, and I'm intrigued to hear the perspective that you're coming from, because I'm recollecting being involved in the review and the drafting of A4, which is the regulatory analysis document for the cost-benefit analyses of support regulation. And one piece of it deals with the question of the appropriate social discount rates to use in these analyses and so forth. And I remember we had had various drafts and these things leaked out of OIRA and they got into the budget examiners, into OMB. And they were all exercised about the fact that there was another OMB guidance document which purports to provide guidance to do the kinds of analyses that you're talking about for budgetary programs. I assume infrastructure programs are part of those programs. So I wonder what that guidance document is for if the OMB isn't taking seriously the kinds of analyses you're talking about. But in any event, I wanted to use that just to spin to another point that I forgot to make earlier on this regulatory budget question that we talked about a little bit earlier. I mean, my recollection of this is that it was the Blair government in the UK that was one of the early users of the idea of 2-for-1 and this sort of thing. And you've got to remember that that was a government that had strong aspirations for new regulations, but also saw a necessity for house cleaning of existing regulations, but they weren't sure how to get the agencies to spend the time to do the house cleaning. So they used this 2-for-1 as like a carrot. The problem I see in the current administration is if you don't have an administration that has a lot of ambitions to do a lot of new regulations, at least not until something like a 9/11 happens and they turn on their feet and start doing something completely different. So if you don't have a lot of aspirations to do new regulations, I don't think there's going to be a lot of practical impact of having this kind of regulatory budget kind of approach to existing regulations, because the agencies don't have a lot of need to find existing regulations because they're not doing very many new regulations. So I think that it's the context is a little bit out of sync, I think, with when the idea has its biggest value.
Anybody else?
Hi, this was fascinating, and a lot of the talk seems to be about how OIRA has been in the past, but is there anything you guys think that OIRA could be doing, or changes in the regulatory process more generally, that you think could improve regulations or the regulatory process?
Yeah, that's perfect.
John had mentioned that there's some bills in Congress. I slightly disagree with his description of the Senate bill as modest. There is a piece of it that would require formal rulemaking for major regs, which is outrageous. Excuse me. Nothing like turning 556 and 557 of the APA over to, in any event, I think Congress is actually thinking a little bit about this issue of how to change it, and it is very difficult to get consensus among all the different stakeholders on how to change it. I think what OIRA can bring is consistency, which was mentioned earlier by some of the people on the panel. There was a recent example on the Department of Labor TIPS regulation where the NPRM did not include the preliminary cost-benefit analysis, which I think is unfortunate. I would hope that what OIRA would do would be to continue to press for the kind of a disciplined analysis and disclosure of that analysis throughout the process. Whether or not the agencies now want to issue new regulations, they may come across some that are not just authorized by Congress, but required by Congress, and the courts seem to be interested in ensuring that if Congress is required that a regulation be issued, the inclination of a cabinet secretary not to issue regulations is not sufficient answer where Congress has spoken. So I think there are going to be some regulations coming down the pike. And to the extent that what can OIRA do? Hold the fort, I guess, is what I would say. And the fort is good decision making.
I'll just respond briefly. I mean, I think one of the things not to do going forward is to continue to expand the kinds of things that OIRA is expected to do. OIRA has a very good skill set, a very good core set of responsibilities, and I would be very hesitant to see that be expanded too greatly. I'll probably disagree with everybody else sitting here when I say I don't think that their jurisdiction should be extended to independent agencies. I don't think that every guidance document should be submitted to OIRA. I do think that OIRA's core role, however, should be strengthened, because that way, and that really does speak to the need or the possible benefits for some regulatory reform. I actually have been in favor of some legislative reform to regulation, also putting me probably at some odds with Sally here, because I do think there are improvements that can be made. But here's what would not be an improvement. Putting OIRA under judicial review for how it has conducted its reviews of agency regs. That's actually the stupidest thing I've heard. All you will do is turn OIRA from what it is really good at doing, pushing back and being an honest broker and saying no to agencies, to an office that is complicit with the agencies from an early day to come up with something that will look good on a checklist for judicial review. And in fact, you're not going to say, that's garbage, agency, change it, because if that ever comes to the light of day, then what's going to happen is, well, you know, OIRA said something was garbage, but then let it go through, and you lose that deliberative process. So I think keep OIRA focused on what it's good at doing, don't put it under judicial review, and don't put it in the business of having to negotiate with multi-commissioner agencies where the back and forth on regulations would be almost impossible, and OIRA will be forced into positions of either compromise or block. Let those agencies do what they want and let Congress take care of them.
I'll just disagree gently and friendly, in a friendly way, on the independent agencies. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think independent agencies, all the evidence suggests, including some that Art has done, that they do a much worse job of analyzing the impacts of regulations before they're issued. And I think OIRA review could be, it could be structured in a way that wouldn't interfere with their independence, so that the commissioners could still override OIRA's analysis, but that would add that check that I think has proved valuable with executive branch agencies and could do so for independent agencies too.
So I agree with Howard on judicial review and Susan on IRCs, and you can see already that it's very hard to do a comprehensive reg reform bill. Now, little bullets along the way, sorry, the reference to ammunition, might be highly salutary. But the impulse is to put it all together, and you end up making it, I think, extremely difficult to succeed.
So let's take one more question and then to lunch. So
Thank you.
last question.
I have a two-part question, and they are linked. It's not two separate questions, just to be clear. In 40 years, the size of the OIRA staff is reduced by roughly half. So first part of the question is, given that responsibilities have grown and the staff has shrunk, what would you say is the optimal size of the staff? And the second part of the question is, knowing that that will never happen, what management changes would you recommend to utilize those scarce resources as effectively as possible?
Just a quick, I thought of the 2-year budget agreement that was just passed. I thought I saw something that the budget for OIRA went from 9 to 10 million, which by the standards that I recall is a pretty substantial increase. I think we maybe got 3 or 4 more desk officers back under Bush 43. So I think there is a prospect that there is going to be a significant increase in staffing at OIRA. I know it's not a done deal. There's lots of things that still have to happen. But I do share some of the concerns about launching into these totally new territories, whether they be independent commissions or whether they be Treasury and IRS and this sort of thing, unless it's in sync with what the capabilities and expertise of OIRA are. And my own feeling about it is that OIRA has tended to have its biggest value when the expertise and training of the career staff are in fact quite different from the agencies that are developing the regulation, because they offer a perspective, an intellectual perspective that's quite different. Treasury doesn't strike to me as like a high priority candidate for that, because it just seems to me they have a lot of people who kind of know and think like some people at OMB think. And independent agencies are probably much more heterogeneous. There's some of them that would be good candidates to have a OIRA review on, and other ones not. So I think it's kind of a more mixed story. But so my perspective would be, think about the kinds of people that are at OIRA that are likely to be attracted to work at an OIRA, and focus their energies on agencies where you think that's going to have the most value. Obviously, if you have a chance to expand it substantially, then you can hire a whole bunch of new kinds of people and then maybe take on some of the broader, ambitious things that people are talking about here. But I don't think 9 to 10 million gets you to that.
Just super quick on the staff cut. That was partly done because of the removal of a certain function out of OIRA over to the management side of OMB, all the eGov stuff, and, good riddance. So the staff cut. but the other.
I like the I in OIRA.
No, that's not the I in OIRA. No, the I in OIRA is very important. But we did a strategic plan, and just to get to your question, what's the optimal size? Given its current workload, we wanted 6 to 8 more FTE to cover what we really thought we needed to cover. And so it wasn't, a doubling of the staff, but, 6 to 8 would, desk officers in addition would have made a very significant difference, I think, in what we could have covered. Now, as John said, and I associate myself 100% with his remarks, if you're going to expand these kinds of tasks, you need to do more. The only other thing I would add is looking only at the size of the OIRA staff misses certain leverage that OIRA has in terms of resources. The OMB, the RMOs, the budget side people at OMB play an important role in regulatory review and often provide very important analytic muscle. The other thing I would note is the independent economic and statistical offices within the agencies, may they please remain independent and well-run, are an enormous and valuable resource to OIRA, as is CEA. So there is much more firepower than 45 FTEs would suggest.
Yeah, I want to agree wholeheartedly with that last comment. There are other resources. And when we struggled with 12866, many of the departments were woefully inadequate in their ability to do anything in this area. And we have seen, since the early 90s, growing capacity at many of the departments and agencies that reflect a lot of investment at the agencies, so that the product that comes over is substantially better in many respects, not all, but in many respects, than what used to come, so that there are other resources out there. And we also had actually, part of the decline was because we only looked at significant regulations, not all regulations. There were a lot of different reasons. That being said, I too applaud the most recent increase. I would ask for more, and my endorsement of centralized review and OIRA review of the IRCs, of the Independent Regulatory Commissions, has always been dependent upon OIRA getting additional resources. They cannot do it with what they have now. So I agree with that piece.
All right, well, let's end it there, and mention there's food, and we'll be back up here for in a little bit after you help yourself to food for the membership meeting, but now let's thank our panelists.
Pleasure as always.
You stayed quiet. I did.